And now we'll begin with, it is KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California, exactly 8 o'clock. And this is Mae Brussell, program number 609, August the 8th, 1982, in Pacific Grove, California. And we begin World Watchers with just a quick resume of what I was talking about last year. Broadcast 557, August the 9th, 1982. A book had come out by Steve Shagan, The Circle, and in that book he has mention of the permanent, faceless, non-elected government in Washington, D.C. These are the Henry Kissingers and so forth, and who run from one country to the other, and through their manipulations of elected officials and their partnerships with the underworld, the mafia, the big business, and their secret buildup of military armaments and nuclear weapons, they are leading us to the edge of extermination. That is a novel. I don't usually talk about novels on this program, but this is a novel, and he wrote the formula, and Steve Shagan seems to be familiar with the way the power structure moves. I also got from the Defense Intelligence Service a resume of Fritz Gustav Anton Kramer when he was in the United States Army, and towards the end of the war, as it was winding down, from September the 20th, 1944 to 18th of April, 1945, remember the war was over, he was in Scotland, he was in England, he was in France, he was in Belgium, he was in Holland, and he was in Germany. His overt area was the 84th Division as a battle clerk, and then he continued overseas serving April 19th, 1945 to October the 20th, 1947 with the European Theater Intelligence School. The other subject, one that was of interest a year ago, was Roy Cohn. I described the future terror coup with Representative Larry McDonald, that he joined the board of the anti-communist group Western Goals. It was founded 3 years ago. That was 3 years ago from 1982. Representative Larry McDonald heads it, and they track and report incidences of subversion, along with Dr. Edward Teller, the John Birch Society, from Alexandria, Virginia, Munich, Bavaria, and European oligarchy, and work with the Knights of Malta. Now, it turns out that 1 year later we learned that Western Goals, through the computer office and John Rees and Mr. J. Paul in Los Angeles, works directly into the computer of the police departments of 50 states and into a computer in Los Angeles that was going to the garage or home of Mary Love, who had a $100,000 computer, to feed information of people who have not committed crimes to 50 police departments around the country. I also talked about Admiral Bobby Inman of Task Force 157, leaving his post as Deputy Director of the CIA to be a part-time consultant to the House Select Committee on Intelligence. I call that the fox in the chicken house. And 1 year later, Mr. Inman was put in charge of the 7 to 10 major computer companies in Texas, where he has probably one of the largest master files of computer information, and he works with the people from Western Goals and Roy Cohn and the whole CIA mafia group. So 1 year later, he's rewarded with his massive computer program in Texas. And I also cited 5 important articles on Banco Ambrosiano and the scandals in the Banco Ambrosiano and the murder of Roberta Calvi that June, and we're up to August now, where they're still looking for the money. They are suing the Vatican. Marcinkus is still in the Vatican. Nothing is clear. They have exhumed Mr. Calvi, and it's not any longer a suicide. The money question appears everywhere and is still pertinent to what is going on at the present time, 1 year later. Now, just to update Mr. Dietrich and Fritz Kramer, this is Adolf Hitler's Kramer. I haven't talked about them for a few weeks. I just want to read you one little page that's interesting about war after the Nazis and how they got together. Mr. Sepp Dietrich was Hitler's most trusted gentleman, along with his general Fritz Kramer, and along with Otto Skorzeny, who for 2 years was using Germans to speak English and putting them into American uniforms to confuse the Americans and melt with the Americans. And after the war, there was never any mention of where Otto Skorzeny got the uniforms and where these people changed their clothes or how they met. But in the book Spandau, written by Mr. Speer, Albert Speer, you can get a pocketbook edition, 1976, it came out. He tells about how when he was a war criminal, he's just beginning his time in jail, and Albert Speer was with the major Nuremberg trial prisoners, and Sepp Dietrich and Fritz Kramer and Otto Skorzeny were with the Dachau trial people. They were supposed to be at separate prison and have a trial for their killing Americans and Belgians at the Malmedy trial. And in the book, Secret Diaries, he tells how he takes a bath in his cell. This is Albert Speer. He says, Mr. Hess, who's still in the Spandau prison, Rudolf Hess and I shower together, and the guard supervises, and one of the German prisoners of war feeds wood into the stove, and they make a fire right there, and they take their shower right in the cell. The shower was set up in our cell block to keep us isolated from the defendants and witnesses in the forthcoming little trial. The Nuremberg was the big trial, and he puts a quote for the little trial, and I'll do a little more updating you next week and the week after on the little trial, which was Piper, Dietrich, Kramer, and Skorzeny. He said, these men are being held in the other wing of the prison. A few weeks ago, an American soldier, often careless about regulations because we're supposed to be apart, let our group and theirs overlap in the prison bath. And one day I found lying beside me, splashing in the warm bath water with as much pleasure as myself, Sepp Dietrich, Hitler's constant companion in the early days. Just visualize, I say with David Emmer, we call this splash, splash. He opens his eyes, and against the orders, the men from the Malmedy Dachau trial are showering and sitting in a little tub with the Nuremberg defendants. He says, Sepp Dietrich was a rather coarse-grained man with a peasant, sound common sense. He was chief of Hitler's bodyguard after 1933. That's the SS, and pretty tough. He was a corporal in the First War, made an amazing career in the Second War, and at the end of 1944, he was commander of the 6th SS Tank Army, bearing the title of the SS Obergruppenführer. I can spell it if you want, OBERSTGRUPPEN, then FUHRER for Hitler, which corresponds to full general. Hitler would refer to him as Mae Brussell, Blucher. That was a very kindly note because Blucher was a hero of his during the Napoleonic Wars, and he referred to him as this great pal. I had met Sepp Dietrich, this is Albert Speer, for the last time during the Ardennes offensive, that's the Battle of the Bulge. He seemed then remarkably indifferent to what was going on. Now this version is totally 180 degrees different than other people's story. He had left the leadership of his SS divisions to his staff, which was a lie, but he was living in retirement during this battle in a remote forest cottage. He had become a grumpy eccentric. Now, he was tried for the crimes of this battle, and they were supposed to get the death sentence, but Senator Joe McCarthy and Nazis from Germany who put him into the Senate made sure they all got out and walked out together. But the point is that he is exposing, Albert Speer, that while the Battle of the Ardennes offensive is going on, he's in a remote cottage. Sepp Dietrich was not in retirement. But again, this could be the safe house because Dietrich and Skorzeny and Fritz Kramer were all together. And if Hitler's Fritz Kramer, the general, was in that little cottage at any time and by a fluke was picked up along with these people, and they had to temporarily stand trial. And that's another story in itself, how they knew they were going to get out, and I'll give you those quotations maybe next week. Dietrich and Piper knew that the trial was just a joke. They had a cottage in the forest where this Albert Speer, in fact, was with Sepp Dietrich, and therefore there could be our friends Otto Skorzeny and Mr. Piper and Fritz Kramer, because that could be where they changed to American uniforms and could go back and forth. And that's the time period that I mentioned last year where Mr. Fritz Kramer was traveling to various countries, Belgium and Holland and Germany and Scotland, after he delivers Heinz Kinzinger to the Battle of the Ardennes offensive and then delivers him to Klaus Barbie and the top generals. Kramer's doing a little bit of traveling. Now, last week I was talking about the information I had on Klaus Barbie and John DeLorean, so I decided I would go right to the background of DeLorean tonight and bring up a few things about John DeLorean, which we have not yet had on the air. I've had 2 broadcasts on DeLorean, and if you want those back broadcasts, you can get them on the locations of where he was when he was at General Motors, with his family, with the way he built his plant in Ireland, and I covered quite a bit of material on John DeLorean and some of his contacts, but there's been a massive amount of information since then, and I haven't updated it. But I'll start this section of the program with 4 major stories that involve John DeLorean or his companies that were in the news this week. The first story came one day after the broadcast here on Kazoo. It was in the Monterey Herald and its Associated Press story, John DeLorean investigation to pick up. With time running out for the prosecution, the federal authorities are moving to form a task force to investigate the finances of John DeLorean and the $17 million his creditors claim is unaccounted for. Well, I called the U.S. attorney in Detroit, and the FBI called me back, and I photocopied for them the information on DeLorean with the phone numbers of the persons who told me about the arrest of DeLorean and William Hedrick, and that DeLorean had been with Klaus Barbie down in Bolivia. And I also called Jeff Gerth of the New York Times because he is the #1 writer on this subject. I haven't seen or heard anything yet, and I have to mail off. I just finished the packet for the FBI and the Justice Department, and I suggested where they might look for this $17 million. Maybe I could save them some time because this money is roving around. And that was U.S. Attorney Leonard Gilman in Detroit. And then he had another fellow call me, and as I said, the FBI called back, which they very seldom do, but which they did. And I said, you're very prompt. In the past, they've usually waited 10 years to catch on to what is happening. But I did turn them on to where this money could come from. The second important article in the paper this week along this subject was the charges against Johnny Carson's lawyer dismissed, sort of. That's the way it's written, sort of. This is the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, and I'm going at length into a complicated tale of John DeLorean, organized crime, Johnny Carson, and the Hollywood connections, the cocaine, the offshore banking, and the mob connections that surrounds this whole milieu. And you won't remember the names or the dates, but you'll get the idea or the tone of what I'm saying. And if you want the chart that goes with it, you can send a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll mail it to you. This article is by Paul Wilner. It says, a federal judge yesterday dismissed racketeering charges against Henry Bushkin, Bushkin, that's the attorney for Johnny Carson, and entertainer Johnny Carson, that's his personal lawyer, and Carson himself, in connection with a lawsuit brought out by 2 of their former partners from a bank, the Commercial Bank of California, that is now defunct. They've been charged with racketeering, and Johnny Carson also, and his attorney Bushkin. The judge dropped the racketeering charges. However, the U.S. District Judge Laughlin Waters refused to grant a summary judgment to dismiss the suit and refused to dismiss the allegations of the federal security law violations. Johnny Carson was or part owner with his attorney, Bushkin, in this bank, Commercial Bank of California in Beverly Hills, and it went belly under, and it dried up just about the time the money dried up when Roberta Calvi was hung, and Mr. Jelly had fled Italy, and Mr. Sindona is in a jail in New York, and the flow of narcotic money was getting tight, and a lot of people were getting exposed. In fact, DeLorean had to get his money fast. In the suit filed in March, 2 men who worked with the bank on the board, a Mr. Kopelson and Mr. Miller, Arnold Kopelson, Kopelson, and Michael Miller, charged that Bushkin had violated federal statutes by engaging in a pattern of racketeering activity. And they brought a potential customer to the bank to effectuate a sharp loan operation and engage in unlawful kickback activities. Now, the crime syndicate fellow that I'll talk about at length is Jack Catain, Catain, now facing federal counterfeiting charges, and he has been identified as having links to organized crime and various law enforcement agencies, including the Angelo Bruno in Philadelphia, and we'll do more on that. The court documents have alleged that Catain, Catain, used the bank, the commercial bank, which is now in receivership as of this summer, to deposit and transfer in violation of federal laws against money laundering. And the documents also have charged that a company owned partly by the John DeLorean Motor Company, which was controlled for a period by Mr. Catain, was used for unlawful purposes by Bushkin, a former director of DeLorean. And this all is important because DeLorean claims that he was singled out and he was a victim. Bushkin's attorney was fighting it, but that is the second important story of the week that the investigation still goes on. They've dropped some charges against Johnny Carson and his attorney, but the others are still going. The next article, it was a two-part article, was from the Los Angeles Times, the judge to freeze the assets of Marc Rich and Company. And I might have mentioned that a few weeks ago, but then it was renewed again. Marc Rich owns 20% of 20th Century Fox, and the judge has tied up and frozen his American money that is in this country, and he has a mysterious career that goes back to oil profits that have to do with the time when Gerald Ford became president and Henry Kissinger was running around inflating the oil prices, and then Rich buys 50% of Pebble Beach and 20th Century Fox and puts Kissinger on the board after Kissinger has made Marc Rich's profits go up to the hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, along that story with Marc Rich was a bigger story. That was the Los Angeles Times, the fourth big story. Out of the shadows, the big commodity firm is suddenly propelled into public spotlight. And this has to do with Marc Rich and Company. And it says big commodities firm is suddenly propelled into the public spotlight. Now, the reason I enjoy this on the front page of the Wall Street Journal so much is that I have been talking about 20th Century Fox Studio with Madame Chennault and Grace Kelly and William Rogers from Resorts International. And every week I do a who's who, Henry Kissinger, because it's very important. As a matter of fact, I talked to a researcher in Los Angeles this morning who called me on a matter and was totally unaware of the cast of characters on the board of that particular studio. Now, the Wall Street Journal has an important background on Marc Rich because as soon as he was buying the studio with Marvin Davis from Colorado, he did put Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission, of the investor in many major corporations and involved with the Kuwait oil scandal there. And, of course, I just like to follow him because the Warren Commission, the deals he made with Nixon, how he got to be president, and he's on these boards. And as soon as Marc Rich bought 50% of Fox Studio, Kissinger, again, surfaces on the board with Gerald Ford. Now, in essence, I'll just give you the highlights of the Wall Street Journal story. It was a front-page story, August the 5th, 1983, Wall Street Journal. It says, the court finds Marc Rich for withholding papers of huge profit in oil deals. He has an annual revenue of $10 billion. He wheels and deals in secret. When he purchased 20th Century Fox, he was the mystery buyer. He's now accused by the United States government of taking a Swiss parent firm, Marc Rich Incorporated, in Switzerland. He has the same Marc Rich Incorporated in the United States and one in Switzerland. Same board, same directors. He claims they're different companies, so you don't have to know what's going on in Switzerland. The government is accusing him of siphoning $20 million in taxes that he owes the United States in 1980 out of the United States and set up a massive tax evasion scheme. Now, most of you, if this were tax season in April, you may not appreciate that, or you may not even appreciate it in August, how one man and one corporation takes $20 million out of the United States, and the profit came from Henry Kissinger raising the oil prices in the early 70s. So you're getting at both ends. You're paying more oil. You're getting this inflation. The profit goes over to Switzerland. They buy up your movie studios. They buy up Pebble Beach, this gorgeous area around here, and God knows what else. And this article says in April 1982, they subpoenaed papers from the Swiss document. The United States questions the Marc Rich Company in the U.S. and the Swiss Marc Rich, and they will not accept the fact that they have the same boards, the owners, but they're independent. The fines started at $50,000 a day, but the company wouldn't be hurt if he paid fines for years. I believe the fee of Howard Hughes to not go to the court trial there's a test case of dropping the stock on Air West and manipulating so he could buy it cheaper and then make a big lot of money. I think he paid $34 million fee not to be seen because there was no Howard Hughes, and the corporation was willing to hand over a $34 million fee. Now, the Energy Department and the Department of Price Controls want to go into the background of this gentleman who in the early 1970s, was raising the oil price. And I've mentioned this on other broadcasts, and I brought out my Jack Anderson article, June the 12th, 1978, or 1977, where he's talking about Henry Kissinger as Secretary of the State as part of a conspiracy to raise the oil prices with the Arabs, and Senator Frank Church was investigating it and challenging the Shah of Iran and Saudi Arabia and the oil cartels, and how Henry Kissinger was behind the raising of the oil prices, and after he raises the prices, Mr. Marc Rich gets the profit, then Kissinger gets on the board of the studio. I think that should be clear to you. I also have an article, March 29, 1975, from the Monterey Herald suggesting the role of Henry Kissinger as Secretary of State, going back to the early 70s, is part of a plan to assassinate and murder the Saudi Arabian king. And I have said how he was with him just days before he died, and they tried to blame a Berkeley student who was on LSD of killing the king, and then they had his head cut off very quickly, the Saudi Arabian justice. He came from Colorado and Berkeley, and they tried to say that the nephew did it, and off with his head. And there were articles at the time that the king of Saudi Arabia didn't want to raise the oil prices in the early 70s, but Henry Kissinger wanted it, and the Shah wanted it, because they could put the profits in Chase Manhattan Bank in New York, and then the money that the Shah got for the inflated oil prices, he could buy weapons, and they also put it in international drug traffic. So in my early files, going back to the early 70s, to support the Wall Street Journal story, it's all there, even the accusations of the murder charges and the role of Henry Kissinger, suggesting he played a role in killing the king of Saudi Arabia right after having him killed, not doing it himself. Now, the Wall Street Journal article talks about the prices that were raised, and it gives the background of Marc Rich, who is another multinational from Europe who came to the United States, not American-born, just identical to Henry Kissinger or Mr. Bluedorn of Gulf and Western. And it seems that there are many, many people born in Europe who come over and take over these multi-billion-dollar corporations. Marc Rich was born in Belgium. Belgium family left during World War II. He lived in New York City and worked for Philip Brothers, Philipp Brothers. He never had a college education. Then he worked for a man, Ludwig Jesselson, Jesselson. And Philip Brothers combined with Philbro Salomon, it became. Many of you have heard that name, Philbro-Salomon. Pincus Green was his partner, and is his partner now. Marc Rich worked for Philbro Salomon and went by Mr. Jesselson to Bolivia, interesting, with Klaus Barbie down there, and to Madrid, where Otto Skorzeny was, and where John McCloy had sent Klaus Barbie along with Henry Kissinger, and Kissinger, the drug emperor, is in power today. Jesselson sent them to Bolivia and Madrid, and in the 1970s, they broke off. They were working for Jesselson with the oil decisions and wanted an increase of salary, and he didn't want to give it to them. So they went into business on their own. But during the Arab oil embargo, they made a fortune, tremendous profits, thanks to Henry Kissinger, who made the policies of war and peace and the raising of oil prices for Chase Manhattan and Nelson Rockefeller. In the 1970s, after this killing of money and after being in Bolivia and Madrid, and also supplying weapons to Ecuador, they weren't just into commodities, they formed their own company and went away from the people who started them, Philbro Salomon, just as Litton Industries started with Howard Hughes' organization, and they splintered off and then became their own organization with the same goals and the same minds. They put spies into the offices of their former employers, according to Wall Street Journal, in Tokyo and in Argentina. Now, in 1974, they started with $2 million. This is the American dream. And then the company got a fast start. $2 million is seed money. By 1976, 2 years later, they're worth $50 million. The headquarters of the Netherlands Antilles, you can imagine how you parlay. I don't know how you do tin and rice and aluminum and ores and sulfur and sugar and grains. Even at that price, I would think it would have to be involved with narcotics and Bolivia and Klaus Barbie, who in the early 70s, with Richard Nixon as president and E. Howard Hunt in office and Frank Sturgis from the gaming tables down in Cuba and Operation Intercept, we escalate the drug importation in this country with the Shah of Iran from that area, from the Southeast Asian War, and the Nugan Bank gets formed. So they parlayed $2 million from 1974 to 76 to $50 million, and now it exceeds several hundred million or into the billions. Their base is in a place called Zub, Switzerland, Z-U-B. They have offices in 30 countries. They sell commodities. They tied up the oil in Nigeria, which is interesting, and then when Richfield wanted to buy oil, they have to go through Marc Rich and Company. The same way with Angola. They tied up the oil in Angola, and when Exxon wants it, they go through Marc Rich and Company, and they supply weapons, as I say, to Ecuador. Now, they tied up the Malaysian mines, the tin in Malaysia, and had monopoly of that. They formed their own company when the United States government wanted to know if they took $20 million worth of tax money and where it is, because I mentioned before that Marc Rich has 50% of 20th Century Fox, and Chris Kraft owns, he owns 50%, and Chris Kraft owns 20%, and John DeLorean's on the board of Chris Kraft. And he's parlaying his fortune way beyond anything he could imagine from the time that he's left General Motors. So the $20 million is missing from Marc Rich, and he's paying his fines, and he starts a company called Clarendon Limited, Clarendon Limited, this summer in 1983, to get the United States courts off his back. He can't tell where his money is. The Vatican can't tell where their several hundred million is. John DeLorean can't tell where his millions are, and they all have common denominators, so that this Wall Street Journal article was very timely today. Now, incidentally, the head of 20th Century Fox before Marvin Davis got it, is Dennis Stanfill, was a person who was forced out by Marvin Davis, and he was a graduate of Annapolis with Jimmy Carter, and he started his own company, and it has the same name of Clarendon. He says it's a coincidence. Can you imagine working for 20th Century Fox, having this organization taken over by Marvin Davis, and you have the same name, and you don't even know that each has the same name, the Clarendon Incorporated or the Clarendon Limited. So this is a guy from Belgium who came to the United States, who had no college education, who invests in the world commodities, who raises our oil prices, who affects our lives in a tremendous way. And he, as I say, is like Gulf and Western with the links to the CIA, the intelligence, the mob, the secret funds. And they are trying to tie up all of his money in the United States, and this can go on for years because he still goes on trading. Now, I mentioned last week the matter of the suggestion that Klaus Barbie had supplied the cocaine for John DeLorean, which is being checked out by the powers that be. And so I went back to my files to remind you of a broadcast I did May the 9th this year, just a few months ago, that W.R. Grace and Company acquired a DeLorean subsidiary that was on the broadcast number 596. W.R. Grace, David Emery found that in the newspapers. Grace acquired Composite Technology Corporation, a plastic subsidiary of DeLorean Motors based in Troy, Michigan. Well, W.R. Grace is the high official for the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, for the Knights of Malta. He was the man who instigated the knighthood of Mr. McMahon, Johnny Carson's co-partner with Alexander Haig just this January. They were knighted into the secret society of the Vatican. W.R. Grace is closely linked to IG Farben and all the Nazi organizations. So by buying a piece of the DeLorean operation, he can travel around to various countries to pick up the missing pieces or the pieces that should not be exposed, because he officially now, in quotes, as a piece of the DeLorean investment. I also spoke to Kevin Coogan in New York, who first broke open the story of DeLorean, of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and he said J. Peter Grace and a Pan-American official set up an airline in Bolivia called Coche Bombay, B-O-M-B-E, in Bolivia, Coche Bombay in Bolivia, and the head of it was attached to the SS Gestapo. He was a Nazi that worked as the head of it, and then when it was reported that a Gestapo chief was running the airline, he left the airline because of his Nazi past and stopped working for Pan Am Airlines, and then became the governor of Cochabamba in Bolivia. So there are very high top Nazis still in Bolivia, and that's the story of Cochabamba. And there's J. Peter Grace down in Bolivia, and also in the United States, and part of the DeLorean empire. Now we'll take a 1-minute break and do some more on Johnny Carson, John DeLorean, and the Mafia, as much as I have time in that complicated web, and see if I can make it a little simple for you so you understand the relationship of Hollywood, drugs, secret offshore bankings, and some of the people who are in the news today. So now we'll go back to side 2, and this is side 2 of broadcast number 609, August the 8th, 1983. I might mention that I talked to Bob Fast in New York. We used to have weekly broadcasts, and I mentioned it maybe before I came on here with the talk show, but I wanted on the World Watchers tape. We did about 3 years of broadcasts with New York, and I met marvelous people in New York doing the program, and there was pressure on the station to take Bob off. He was fired, and I was taken off, real quickly. They wouldn't say where we were or what we were doing, and in the years, the news has gotten worse and worse, and people remember the things that we had been saying and trying to explain and expose. And finally, I talked to Bob this week, so we're going to begin the World Watchers in New York City and Manhattan. They've moved from 62nd Street to, I think, 34th Street. So I'll do a 1 half hour tape, a summary of what we do here on World Watchers for New York, or we'll do a live show probably starting tomorrow, a half hour of live broadcasting and then questions from New York City to California. There's some live, interesting people out there with great questions who are concerned. So I'm looking forward to that. And, of course, I talked to Paul Krasner, who published my first stories. A lot of years have gone by, but it seems like yesterday to me, and a lot of water under the bridge. But when you're working for a project and you hang in there in some way or other, you get together and stay together and have that tenacity. Things do come together, and you can continue your project, even though some stop for a while, but the struggle was constant, and we'll all be working on these things together. Now, there was a story in Rolling Stone, you might have seen it. It came out in March of 1983 of John DeLorean, and he claimed that he was being framed. And the Rolling Stone article by a fellow named Latham, Latham, Aaron Latham. And there's a quotation in there I want to mention briefly, and I can do more on that article later. According to the Rolling Stone, DeLorean said that he wanted to withdraw from the drug sting that he was getting caught into. And James Timothy Hoffman, 41 years old, said to him in quotes, "Look it," and there's a profanity, "you're in this too far now. You know all the players, you know the bank, you know this and that, and you," profanity, "around, and your kids are going to get killed. It's going to be a bloody mess. You know the bank," and I don't know if it was the Eureka Federal that he was talking about, because he had contacts with bank more important than the Eureka Federal in Palo Alto. Now, another story apropos of the bank, and before I get to it, Wall Street Journal, April the 4th, 1983, ties to alleged mobster caused bank troubles. And that's the bank I was saying that was in the news today of Johnny Carson and his friend Mr. Bushkin. And this story says that 2 years ago, a bank partially owned by entertainer Johnny Carson and his attorney gave a party for one of their best customers, Jack M. Catain Jr., now under federal indictment for dealing in counterfeit $50 and $100 bills, was the subject of a report linking him to Chicago and Philadelphia organized crime. He resigned as chairman of Rusco Industries, RUSCO, in 1980 as part of a consent from the Security Exchange Commission because of diverting corporate funds illegally to benefit himself and others. The Commercial Bank of California loaned Mr. Catain a sum totaling at least $370,000. It could be $1 million. It's at least $370,000. They gave a party for him. He had set up $700,000 on deposit for this small, closely held bank at various times. He brought in friends and business associates as new borrowers. He guaranteed them loans on a lien of a $1 million home in Encino. At one time, when they wanted some money back and there was a loan on the house burned down in 1981, and they were left with this empty lot. At the time that Mr. Carson and his attorney, Henry I. Bushkin, were listed as co-chairman of the bank, together they owned 23.7% of the bank stock. And they got in trouble with overdue balances and loans and bad loan problems, and the California Banking Department shows that a major part of the bad loans in 1982, it wrote off $2.5 million in loan losses. Now, we don't know who the payoffs are. I'm very suspicious of the John Belushi murder, of various things that happened in Hollywood and the network around these people. And those jobs, I don't say that this money went for that job, but those jobs cost money. And here's a bank that we'll talk about where there's $2.5 million that's out, just like Michael Sindona, $45 million in the Franklin National Bank. Now, this Encino home burned to the ground at the time that they were going to get defaulted loans on his property. In 1978, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal linked this fellow, these alleged crimes of Mr. Catain, and organized crime figures. So Johnny Carson and his attorney, Mr. Henry Bushkin, could have checked out the New York Times and Wall Street Journal if they wanted to. And he was charged with transferring illegal funds between Catain and Angelo Bruno, chief of the Philadelphia Mafia, who was shot in death in 1980. Now, that's interesting because the Angelo Bruno death happened at the time that Dr. Tarnower was murdered by Gene Harris, and both of them I had done extensive programs on and believed they were bag people for the CIA, and that the drug traffic, a lot of it, came out of his hometown, and that they knew a lot more about worldly events. They'd been in the Soviet Union together just a short time before Lee Harvey Oswald went there as an agent, and they traveled to Africa and all over the world. And she worked for the CIA in the Madeira School down in Washington, D.C. They were heavily involved in a lot of scandals and mob activity, particularly her 2 years in Madison Square Garden before she went to the Madeira private school. A very interesting person, but when Angela Bruno was murdered in Philadelphia, I knew it entangled a lot of high-up political people, and it turns out that Mr. Jack Catain was linked to Angelo Bruno, who died in 1980, and yet this bank is formed in 1980, and he's part of Rusco Industries with Johnny Carson and John DeLorean, and is under investigation, and he joins this bank and is giving his home as part of the loans, and people can go through the bank and get money, and he was the character, one of the characters tied to the bank. We don't know where the other loans went. Now, this is one of the things I like to do, is to take a complicated story and chart it out for you. And as I say, if you don't understand the names and I rattle them off, you'll get the tone of the story, and as best we can in this remaining time. And if you want a chart of it, you can write to me at Box 22511, Mae Brussell, Carmel 93922. Self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll send you the chart of the broadcast this evening with the sources. Now, in essence, this involves Johnny Carson, Henry Bushkin, John DeLorean, Jack Catain of the mob, and Robert Durand, one of the most notorious organized crime figures in all of Hollywood or the Western world. And I'll run through the banks and the companies and show how they overlap and how Carson's bank overlaps with these people and Mr. Bushkin, and do the best I can. The Los Angeles Bank, it's in Beverly Hills, the Commercial Bank of California, that was quickly closed just at the time of Roberta Calvi's death and the P2 scandal in Italy, was founded by Johnny Carson and Henry Bushkin, Carson's personal attorney. This is from the Los Angeles Herald, June the 30th, 1980, a long story which I outlined for you. I'm giving you the high points of the story. The bank was used to make deposits and to transfer funds in violation of federal law of laundering money. Money was put into the bank and not recorded as a deposit, and it was taken out to the Cayman offshore islands and not recorded as going out of there. Bushkin, and Carson's attorney and founder of the bank, was a former director of DeLorean Motor. Now, as soon as somebody is arrested, everybody's a former member. Keep in mind, it's a former bank and a former member. But until all this broke, they were pretty cozy. Now, the bank, he was part of this John DeLorean Motor Company, and he forms a bank with Johnny Carson. There was a company called TMX Systems. It had to do with lock systems on cars, I suppose, or TMX Systems. There were two companies, TMX and TMX Systems, just like Marc Rich makes his two different companies with the same names. It tries to say they're different people and the same people. TMX Systems is a company that was owned in part by John DeLorean and Mr. Bushkin, Carson's attorney, where they made illegal deposits and transferred funds to the Commercial Bank of California since 1978 and violated laws to prevent money laundering. That's what they were doing with TMX System. The Commercial Bank had missing money, and the common denominator in the bank was John DeLorean, the money laundering going through the Commercial Bank, and it was forced to close in April of 1983. DeLorean was arrested in October of 82. The FDIC closed it because of hundreds of thousands in bad loans. Now, certain customers who were known to have affiliations with organized crime were brought to the bank by Mr. Bushkin, a partner of DeLorean Motor, and Jack Catain of organized crime and the allegations of the Angelo, Bruno, you get that background. Okay. The commercial bank with Carson and Bushkin made loans of, it says, at least 42, again, it doesn't say how much, to a subsidiary of TMX. There was TMX, and then there was TMX subsidiary, which is partly owned by DeLorean. And Bushkin was director of the commercial bank, and he was secretary treasurer of TMX as a partner of John DeLorean, and the attorney for Johnny Carson. He has an office in Century City. So Bushkin is the common denominator between DeLorean and TMX, and with Johnny Carson and the bank. Now, Bushkin and DeLorean Motors with Jack Catain had extensive dealings. The cover was auto alarm systems made through their company and its subsidiaries, and TMX Systems and TMX Corporation. That's the way they were called. And TMX made deposits and transferred funds without the bank reporting the deposits or transferring them without any regulation according to the regulations of banking. And the lawsuit of the two men that I mentioned have the suit against this claim that Bushkin failed to disclose his relationship with various companies that used the bank when the bank was formed. He didn't tell them about his contacts with DeLorean, and one loan was made to a corporation which was guaranteed by Bushkin, and he didn't say that it involved DeLorean Motor, Jack Catain of the crime syndicate, and one or more who owned TMX. He was a director on the bank. He didn't mention his contacts with the companies who took money out of the bank, and he didn't mention their backgrounds, which anybody, we're not talking about a bunch of virgins in Hollywood. You know darn well that they knew what was going on. Now, Jack Catain had a part with the DeLorean Motor and controlled it for unlawful purposes. He set up a corporation, the TMX, and then another fellow named Durand, Robert Durand, a crime figure who's involved with the John DeLorean case, was a part of this operation. Durand was an admitted cocaine trafficker with corporate connections with DeLorean, Johnny Carson, and Bushkin, and he set up a company called Radkin, Radkin Estates Corporation. It was owned by Robert Durand to make deposits to transfer to the commercial bank, that's Carson's bank, and Bushkin, who's a partner of DeLorean. It was formed to make legitimized millions of dollars of drug traffic profits. The Radkin Estate Corporation was a front, and Henry Bushkin, the partner of DeLorean and the lawyer for Johnny Carson, was the co-founder of Radkin Estate Corporation. And some of this I'll repeat so it gets clear to you, that the attorney for Johnny Carson, who owns a corporation with John DeLorean, forms another corporation, Radkin Estates. So you have the Commercial Bank of California sending money out that isn't in the deposit books to offshore islands. You have two companies, the TMX, and two different titles, TMX Incorporated and TMX Systems, with hanky-panky under the cover of auto alarms. And then Radkin Estates, which is multi-million-dollar funding of drug traffic with Henry Bushkin as part of, he was the registered agent for the Radkin Estate Corporation. So he knew perfectly well what was going on, and as I say, these are not babies into this business. Now, the commercial bank was missing money, and there was a lawsuit by Michael Miller, I mentioned him, and Arnold Kopelson, that the bank was used for racketeering practices. Now, this is the racketeering case that was dropped. This article was in June, and it was dropped in August, but it's still alive. They were accused of racketeering processes, and the interrogatories on the trial before it got started claimed that Catain and crime figures were allowed to make deposits in the bank and then transfer them out of the bank without the bank reporting the deposits or without the bank reports to federal regulatory authorities. And TMX made these transfer funds without the appropriate information. Now, the lawsuit says that Mr. Bushkin failed to disclose, as I said, his business with these companies, And the lawsuit describes what they say in quotes as a complicated series of financial transactions and accusations of self-dealing loans by the commercial bank to bank directors violating the bank regulations. This is in the lawsuit. The lawsuit says that Radkin Estates was founded by drug trafficker Durand, and I'll do more on the program next week just on Durand, who was allowed to deposit and transfer and not report hundreds of millions of dollars of laundering. He's a multi-million-dollar cocaine king. And remember, the cocaine king down for our country is down in Bolivia, Klaus Barbie and Mr. Gomez. He was involved in admitted multi-million-dollar cocaine and formed Radkin for drug traffic and put it into real estate in Malibu. Now, Henry Bushkin, this is Johnny Carson's attorney, as I said, was the registered agent for Radkin. Durand was a law client of Henry Bushkin's as well as Johnny Carson's into this multi-million-dollar cocaine. Henry Bushkin is also was a director of DeLorean Motor Company, and Bushkin is the banking partner of Johnny Carson. So he is the registered agent for the skimming of multi-million, not little bit. And Robert Durand is one of the biggest cookies of the drug traffic of the whole Hollywood industry. So Bushkin is a registered agent for that corporation. Durand is a client of his at Century City. He's one of the directors he was of DeLorean Motor, and he ran the bank with Johnny Carson. Now, the role in the DeLorean arrest, in piecing this together, the role of Durand in DeLorean case was that in 1980, Durand was the target of an investigation by the Drug Enforcement Agency. In 1979, the Vatican and Milan, not Vatican, began to get embroiled into the missing money, the tax money out of Italy and the scandals in Europe, and I'll make those connections to Europe in the next week or two to this particular case. But in 1980, the DEA was beginning to investigate Durand, who had been making sacks of money going back and forth to the offshore islands. This is after Watergate, after Richard Nixon's out of office, and people with the Church Committee and the congressional investigations, people are getting a little smarter and looking into the Castle Island, the offshore islands, and Durand was going to be the target of investigation. So he became an informer, which is something he does well, in return for immunity from prosecution and from his multi-million-dollar drug traffic that he could enjoy. So in his briefings with the Drug Enforcement Agency, he fingered two people, William Morgan Hetrick of Mojave Aircraft and James Timothy Hoffman, a drug trafficker. Now, Hetrick is one of the best-known drug traffickers going back and forth to South America, and he's the fellow who allegedly, I was told, was the one who drove John DeLorean down there for the cocaine and deal with Barbie. Now, he turned in, Durand didn't want to be arrested, so he fingered Morgan, Hetrick, and Hoffman. And Hoffman just conveniently had an estate in San Diego that backed up to John DeLorean, but Christina, Ferrari DeLorean's wife, had known Hetrick for over 10 years and was part of the crowd. I'll do more about those contacts, about John DeLorean and his wife, going back 10 years. All of this just didn't happen because a car company was falling apart. So Hoffman was fingered by Durand as well as Hetrick. And in 1981, Hoffman was arrested by the Drug Enforcement Agency with his cocaine longtime dealer. And to get off his back, Hoffman became a government witness to help investigate William Hetrick. They had worked together for years in all kinds of flight investigations and testified against each other. They had been caught and released over and over again. But Durand was wanted by the DEA, and he fingered Morgan and William Morgan Hetrick and Hoffman. And then Hoffman says, okay, I'll get Hetrick because he's into this big deal with John DeLorean. So Hoffman lured DeLorean, as the story goes, into the cocaine deal, and Hoffman introduced DeLorean to his long friend Hetrick, but Christina DeLorean knew Hetrick for over 10 years. October 19th, 1982, Hetrick and DeLorean were arrested with $24 million in cocaine. Now, Durand, this Mr. Robert Durand, was an long associate of John DeLorean and Mr. Bushkin and Johnny Carson and their banks, got arrested in 1980. He offers to inform and cause Hoffman's arrest. Hoffman now lives next door to DeLorean in San Diego. Hoffman, in turn, offers to bring Hedrick and DeLorean if he can get off. And here is the interesting story about this bank and the connections. DeLorean has a car company now, and Henry Bushkin is a director of DeLorean Automobile. But he's also the director of Robert Durand Association in Malibu. And they use Carson and Bushkin's bank for narcotic deposits and transfer and offshore money. And Bushkin is the partner of Johnny Carson, and they use mob figures, and Carson has put $50,000 into John DeLorean's car company. So obviously, Mr. Durand and Bushkin and Carson really wouldn't want DeLorean caught or fingered because they all have some connections to John DeLorean, and it would come too close to them, except that the California bank had to close. It was losing money. It had questionable deposits, and maybe some of the DeLorean money, because Mr. Bushkin is part of the DeLorean Motor Company, and Johnny Carson's put money into DeLorean. So when it falls through and other investigations might take place with the bank, they have to, with a question mark, sacrifice John DeLorean, who came out here from General Motors, who's been on the fringe of hanky bank business for a long time. They have to protect Robert Durand, the number one probably dealer in Los Angeles. They have to protect they can sacrifice Mr. Hedrick, but he's pleaded guilty. And they have to protect him because, according to what I heard, he says, I'll plead and turn on DeLorean and plead guilty if my sons don't get involved. Now, I've asked these various parties to check out the sons and see if, in fact, they were flying with them. So TMX, that one corporation I mentioned, was giving you the background of the mob connections to that, was originally sold by Henry Bushkin, the attorney for these various people, and a man named Nathan Sassover, Sassover. And he employed Jack Catain, again, this crime figure with the Angelo Bruno background and goodness knows coast-to-coast crime figure. And then they turned over this corporation, RUSCO, a Westwood firm that was run by Catain, the mob figure. And then Rusco was sold for $450,000 to a group of investors, including Northern Ireland Development Agency for the DeLorean Car Company. I hope this isn't too complicated for you because getting back to these corporations, there was TMX Incorporated, TMX Systems, and TMX Marketing Corporation. And it originally was with Nathan Sassover and Jack Catain of organized crime with a long list of forging and crime problems. He's been arrested now, Jack Catain. And they turned this over and parlayed it because the Security Exchange Commission was on it and sold it to a group. Now, we don't know who the group of investors are, whether it was coming out of Klaus Barbie, out of Bolivia. One of the things that John DeLorean did, and I'll share those articles with you in the weeks to come, is he allegedly was offering 100% of the car company to the crime syndicate for something like $50 million. So where was the $50 million then going to go? What would he do with the car company, have the name DeLorean, as many corporations or movie studios do today, but belong to those faceless people that are described in the book The Circle, the mob syndicate, the military, the drug traffickers, and the Defense Department agents. So Rusco, RUSCO, headed by Nathan Sassover and Jack Catain, was sold to a group of investors, including the Northern Ireland Development Company, for DeLorean's car. And then Henry Bushkin, at the time of the sale of TMX, that became part of DeLorean in Ireland, was also a director of the DeLorean Motor Company. Now, as I say, unless you get a chart of this, you may wonder, about these names, but this bank was formed in 1978 by Mr. Bushkin and Johnny Carson, and it was used for offshore money of mob figures. They entertained Jack Catain, who was very much part of a company that later was owned by John DeLorean Motor, the common denominator, the attorney Bushkin being for both and on the board of DeLorean. And also Robert Durand was involved with the bank and with the organized crime cocaine traffic through South America, Bolivia, Colombia, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and pumping it into Hollywood. This is the Hollywood mainly connection, I suppose. And New York has its own turf. I'm sure that's why Roy Radin was murdered in Hollywood. When he tries to hit this turf, he's out of his element. Well, these people are tied in to these banks, to offshore banking, to John DeLorean. So when he is seen coming to court clasping his Bible with a sad face that he was trapped, you can believe that there is a much bigger story and that Johnny Carson, too, will fall in some place into this story as it evolves. Now, there's another story, bond for man in DeLorean case cut. This is Mr. Hetrick. And he made, this is the Los Angeles Times, Hetrick had made literally millions of narcotic-generated dollars. He's put them in bank accounts at the Grand Cayman Islands. His company, Morgan Aviation, is listed as his corporate tax return, 100% owned by the Cayman corporation known as MBM Enterprises. He has excess of $1 million proceeds he wires and transfers all the time to the Cayman Islands. As a matter of fact, he was worried when he was arrested on how to invest the interest on the money that he has in the banks down there in the offshore banking. But then you get people like Johnny Carson and Mr. Bushkin traveling with this kind of traffic, opening a bank, and the reason it did collapse is because of the Italian bank scandals and the drug traffic scandals that evolved as the Italian government closed in on Michael Sindona and Licio Gelli and Roberta Calvi. Another story last December, December the 10th, judge appoints auditor to check DeLorean books. Now, he was arrested in October, and in November and December and January, February, March, April, May, they're still looking for that missing money. That's why it was so interesting for me to call the Justice Department in Detroit, Michigan, the U.S. Attorney, and have a long conversation with them, which they very seldom did before, and they were receptive, and to describe the Utah firm where money allegedly went out, and is that $17 million in the account of John DeLorean identifiable? Did it come from Bolivia, from Klaus Barbie? And, of course, they can begin going again into the Carson Bushkin bank connections. Briefly, one story, we got one more minute, a story in November when he was first arrested on John DeLorean. DeLorean informer reported to have lied in an earlier case. And this has to do with Mr. Hoffman and Mr. Hetrick. They've been friends going back 10 years in litigation, and in 1979, they were accusing each other of various scandals and drug deals and kickbacks. I wonder why in the heck the government doesn't just pull these people in. Well, that's a stupid question. They don't. They let these multi-million-dollar dealers continue to flood this country with narcotics that goes down to the fiancés of death down in Bolivia and the death squads in Argentina and Chile and Brazil. And all that drug money is being used for killing and for Gestapo and armbands. And these guys that are pulled in are involved with hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of identifiable banks. And there's nothing the Justice Department tries to do. They get a big one and he fingers another one and they let the two off and they finger a third one. And then finally they get DeLorean and they say, well, let's bring him in. He doesn't like General Motors. So the bottom of the line is DeLorean, and he's the one who's going to take the rap, and he hasn't any leg to stand on, I don't think, because he's kept some pretty bad company. Well, our time is up. This is another hour. It's 9 o'clock, and it's Mae Brussell on KAZU FM. So you take care, and I'll be back with you next week to continue some more on the saga of John DeLorean and the drug traffic.